This week, the Genesis boys go searching for the meaning of Britannia, but find out the real treasure was in lawn mowing. This week, 1973's Selling England by the Pound. Hello, and welcome back to a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. I am your host, Ian Prize. So when last we left Genesis, guitarist-bassist Mike Rutherford, keyboardist Tony Banks, and singer and flautist Peter Gabriel had been joined by guitarist Steve Hackett and drummer Phil Collins. The band had just wrapped up Nursery Crime, a delightful hodgepodge of crazy tales and straight-down-the-middle prog. Shortly after Nursery Crime, they began working on 1972's Foxtrot, a prog rock staple which included the 20-minute magnum opus Supper's Ready. This is an album I promise we'll get to someday, but it would be a moderate commercial hit and would see them on a modest but well-received tour. And just like that, they were back in the UK with only 3 months to rehearse and record a new album. But they lacked material. So as per the usual, each of the 5 members of the band chucked something into the pot, and the resulting album, Selling England by the Pound, retains some of the delightful hodgepodge nature of Nursery Crime, but with the confidence of a band that has had 2 more years on the road to mature and cohere. So this album contains everything that makes this era of Genesis tick, and would be fixed around 4 long songs: Dancing with the Moonlit Night, a meditation on Englishness, the pure prog explosion of the Firth of Fifth, and the mythological wanderings of the finale cinema show. Also included would be an acoustic number featuring a heartbroken Phil Collins, a Steve Hackett instrumental jam after the ordeal, and the band's first true hit, a single that made it to 21 in the UK, I Know What I Like. So for me, this is Genesis, right in the pocket of prog, bringing the best version of their Gabriel-era sound with themes I love. So I have placed this as my second jewel in the mighty tiara of prog. So, to discuss Selling England by the Pound today are the one and only Brian Gann.
Hello.
And the also one and only Anne Robison.
Thank you for having me.
Hello. And also the voice of Middle England, Rufus Daw. Hello, Rufus.
Hello. What a what an overwhelming responsibility I have.
Oh yeah, no, you've got to speak for all of Fair Britannia, so this is this is your job today. So we will start with our resident Genesis expert, Anne.
I'm the expert?
You are the expert of Genesis, having self-declared expert of Genesis. So, talk to me about where Genesis were, or where you are on this album.
To be honest, I did consider myself a fan of Genesis, and it's only after listening to this album that I realize I'm a fan of Phil Collins' Genesis of the 1980s.
Oh, twist.
Well, so I knew that Peter Gabriel was the lead singer before Phil Collins, and I had somewhat followed Peter Gabriel's solo career after he departed, but I didn't realize
that you could put the peanut butter with the chocolate and get this wonderful combination.
It was unexpected what this album sounded like. I'd never heard it before. This is my first time listening to this album, and now when I tell people that I am a Genesis fan, I now have to be specific about what era of Genesis.
Post-75.
Which is not to say I did not enjoy this album. Simply, I don't know if I'd call myself an expert of this album. And I don't know how much I would rate this on re-listenability, personally.
Very interesting. We'll put a pin on that for now, but then we're going to put you on the psychologist's couch, because you're a fan of Genesis and you're a fan of musical theater. So I'd have thought this would be a
home run.
A home run. But perhaps this is a simple walk to second base.
Yeah, because he dressed up for some of the tours for this album, right?
Oh, yes, he did.
As per usual.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we spoke about that a bit with Nursery Crimes with Ed, yeah.
So, and we'll get into that. Oh, we'll definitely get into that. But, Rufus, your first thoughts on Selling England by the Pound?
I mean, generally I really like the album. I think they've certainly matured by this point, so much so that their sound is solidified, and I do think there's more thought over when and where they do it. But they're still doing it.
I hear confidence.
Yeah. They're confident in their band skin now.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. So, Brian, how did you find this album at the gates?
For Loving Prog, my Peter Gabriel Genesis experience is quite limited. To be honest, I was shocked how many albums they recorded with Peter Gabriel. I thought it was going to be like 3.
Yeah.
I've heard of this album. The fact it's their 5th album together was kind of crazy to me. Because I know like Nursery Crime, but really I think in depth going through each song, more or less it's the first time I've heard this. I think I've heard I Know What I Like, but I would say this is kind of a discovery for me as well.
Very interesting, because as I said at the beginning, this is the second in what I personally consider to be the great 4 prog albums. Now, that is to also say I think it's an unbelievably bloated and uneven album, and we'll get to all the reasons why that's probably the case right now. So, as I said, they had gone to the studio after Foxtrot, their highly acclaimed 1972 album, and they were depleted of all of their songs. So they went back in, and Mike Rutherford in his book describes this as a very painful phase of just fruitless jamming and jamming and jamming and jamming. I also think this is a period where all 5 of the members had a lot to say about what was going into the album, and this might just be a too many cooks spoileth the broth type of album. What did you guys experience, I guess, on those 2 points? Did this feel like a band that was out of ideas? And did this feel like a band that perhaps had maybe not too much direction and maybe a lot of separate songwriters chucking stuff in?
The term indulgent is used a lot with prog rock, and it's a label I think that a lot of times I would fight back against, but this is a time where I'm like, this is indulgent. There's a lot of styles, there's a lot of voices, kind of all crammed in there. This is the second time you get to hear Phil Collins sing on a Genesis album before he takes over. There are some nice little moments, but there is a few songs that just don't work for me.
A few songs out of 8 songs. No, I'm actually very much with you.
I would agree. Some of the transitions in the songs were quite abrupt to my ear, although I did particularly enjoy the flute solo that immediately transitions to an electric guitar solo, and it was very much Madrigal-esque immediately into 1970s
Guitar God.
Guitar, yeah. I would agree that it does feel like there was a lot of input and a lot of it was taken.
Yeah. So the fun little factoid about this physical album is I think it clocks in at 50 minutes, and it was actually so long that the album was mixed quieter because you have like literally limited time on a disc. So if you have a longer album, the band has to be smaller around the physical LP. So this album was actually mixed to be quieter so that they could stuff all 50 minutes of rock in.
That is a fun fact.
It's a great little fact. So I was going to say, to your point about indulgence, it is funny that it is, at the end of the day, Genesis, who I don't think are actually, I never think of as the great noodlers of prog rock, but they really indulged in this, on this album. I guess then, and to your point, I feel like this is an album that jumps around quite a bit. Personally, for me, it's one of the great ones because the highs are so high. There's a lot of stuff I would have taken a scalpel to and just kind of shaved it down. But I had touched on this a little bit in Nursery Crime. I think the most interesting thing about Genesis for me is they never offend me. Like, I'm never annoyed listening to Genesis. There's times where I'm like, okay, you guys, and I'm checking the watch a little bit. But I'm never, ever annoyed.
My personal thoughts are that it's not too much. I mean, I know they bring their kind of lengthy songs, the 10-minute, 9-minute songs. But
Yeah.
because of the content and the way it's made, I don't know if it's because it's more poppy. Maybe that's a thought to explore later. But I don't mind taking that 9-minute journey compared to when I'm taking that 9-minute journey with ELP. So it's it's a lot more of a smoother ride.
Yeah, and maybe a funner ride.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Like, there's a handful of like King Crimson songs that offend me, and I cannot wait for them to get over, or I just plain skip them. I didn't find myself racing to, check my watch on some of these songs. None of them are horribly long either, at least in prog rock terms.
I think we got 8, 7, 10, and 11.
That's...
I was going to say 10 minutes is a pretty long song. And
that's like an intro for Yes. I mean, that's like, they're just warming up.
That's the hit single. Yeah. No, so I'd say to that point, I feel like I experienced this album almost more as opera, where it's like little chunks that come and go, and I experience it as like one continuous bit of music. This also means that I phase out sometimes, but then I come back in, I'm like, ooh, that bit's nice, or like I'm excited for the riff to come up or whatever. Like I experience it more in that sense, where it's like this beautiful river that I'm just floating down on. Sometimes I notice the scenery, sometimes I just have a nap. So do you think that leanness changes how an album is received? There's an adage in music mixing that never give them a reason to turn off the song. And I'd say that's probably true for albums as well, where I think if you are really drifting by the middle of this album, you're like, well, screw it. I'm already bored by the second song or whatever. You're going to ask me to stay around for 2 10-minute songs? I think leanness does help things. This is why people release 4-minute singles and not 10-minute singles. We talked about Revolver at the very, very, very beginning of all this. And the fact that that's 14 songs, each of 3 minutes, every song's kind of snappy. It's an instant classic. Whereas I think this one, there's actually a lot of murk to sift through.
I don't know if this is going to make sense to anyone but me, but typically the way I would prepare for this podcast is I kind of just play the album in background, like going to work, walking, and then I sit down and I listen to each song individually to take notes. And this is an album where when I sat down to actually figure out where the song transitions were, I realized I didn't really know when the songs began or end.
Okay, yeah.
Which, for better or worse, obviously there are transitions, but I was kind of like, oh, that's this song. I thought that was this other song. Like, I would glance at my phone to see occasionally what song is playing, but I realized I didn't actually know which song was which until I really listened to it.
I've talked earlier about Yes's soloing ability, where they keep their solos kind of choppy and they do 10 seconds here, 10 seconds there, and don't just kind of like wind on and on. And I feel like Genesis does have a tendency to do that, where they wind and the solos kind of just keep continuing. And I wouldn't even say really build. They kind of just roll.
There is no climax to a lot of the solos.
Nor, honestly, to a lot of these songs.
Another fair point, yeah.
And I was going to say, I will actually touch on that, but I'm looking down my song list here, and I can't think of a song that like ends with like a cannon blast or anything like that.
That's the end of the fucking song.
That's the end of that song.
I don't know if that's a bad thing. I guess you kind of want to have that climax, to have that resolution in terms of the song. I can definitely see why without that you would kind of see it as a rock opera. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think the harpsichord flute outro lends itself to being played on the radio, even at the height of prog rock in the, I guess we're in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It makes me wonder why it was included. It makes me wonder about the, internal debate and discussion that went into writing this and including those moments.
So, as I touched on at the beginning, so there's 5 members of Genesis and 5 writing members of Genesis, and I think all of them had a thing they wanted to include. So Tony wanted to include Firth the Fifth, Phil wanted to include More Fool Me, and then Steve wanted to include After the Ordeal. And then I think Tony and Mike wanted some instrumental bits, Steve wanted some guitar bits, Peter wanted a lot of vocal bits, and so I think they all just started chucking stuff in. Then they got a new producer for this album, John Burns, and I think he was young, like the same age as them.
This is all, you suspect that this is what happened?
So the writing part is lore. That is what they say happened, is that everyone chucked a bit in. Then I was just thinking about the producer, and I suspect that could be the case for the producer. You know, say unlike, George Martin for the Beatles, where he was a studio producer, like he was working for the studio system. So he's like, give me a 2.5-minute hit. And even down the road, he was like, okay, we can do all this crazy stuff, but let's still make it into a mature song. I think this one, they got a guy who, quote unquote, got what they were trying to do, which could also mean that he was like, oh, great, I support with no reservations you making these prog epics, rather than, maybe a little bit of editorializing and like snipping some of this stuff down.
One thing that jumped out to me is everybody is 22 or 23 when they record this album, and it's their 5th album. So they're still quite young men at this point, but they already have 4 albums under their belt. I think they were all like 19 when they did their first album.
Yeah.
And I feel like, they always talk about like Phil kind of being like the young guy, but he's only a year younger than the rest of them. So I think he's 22 about.
I think actually, so that flags up yet another point with, this album and then albums at this stage in general. I think something I always forget is the album is an artistic statement, but it's not like this magnum opus. I think the thing you get reading the biography of all these bands is basically last year they did an album, then they went on a tour, then they did an album, then they went on a tour and they did an album. Like as you say, like these guys have done 5 albums in 4 years. I think that churn lends itself to, oh dear God, for our record contract, we have to do the next album so we can do the next tour. So they wrote this album, I don't know, in like a handful of months or like a month, recorded it in 3 weeks. Then I think fairly soon after they were on the road promoting it. And so you're lucky if you're the Beatles, where every 8 months you come up with what goes on to be a perfect classic album. I think that's why they're the Beatles. I think for the rest of these bands, it's like this never-ending nightmare where it's like, oh my God, like we just finished Fragile. We have to make Close to the Edge now. Like, Jesus Christ. Like one moment's peace. And so I think that lends itself very much to having to just get whatever musical scraps are near you and then put them into songs and then record the songs and then off you go. So they said that this album was pretty hard to make after Foxtrot, their 1972 album. Do you hear the struggle? Because I actually really don't. I actually think it sounds a pretty easy breezy album.
I can understand why they would say that, but like you, I don't hear that. Like it gels together as if they have been in a recording studio all together, working through it for weeks on end, rather than it kind of being piecemeal, as they describe it themselves. So yeah, I don't hear it, honestly, and that's probably credit to them.
And I mean, actually, I gotta also say, on the theme of struggle, now to be fair, Genesis had already done this in essence twice before, but I'm challenging you, the listener at home, to piece together a 10-minate song about a Battle of Epping Forest. Jesus. As in, I actually do think these are ambitious songs. That was my gauntlet laid down. No, these are ambitious songs, and so it's like I could understand actually how it could feel like pulling teeth sometimes, I'm sure.
Yeah. To be fair, this is now touching on an aspect of the music industry that I don't really understand, which is that cycle. Yeah. I am not surprised that they were successful in producing so much content and also having a heavy tour schedule, but that doesn't mean it's not impressive.
Yep. So off we go to the first track on this album, Dancing with the Moonlit Night. So I guess something I hadn't really touched on in the intro that much is that this is an album ostensibly exploring the spirit of Britain or something like that. And how this was expressed on stage was costumes. So Peter Gabriel, as frontman of Genesis, is famous for his costume work. So for this album, he came out alone on stage and would sing the intro to this album, which is a great a cappella intro, dressed as Britannia. This song specifically is full, apparently, of all sorts of, well, you can hear it, all sorts of British imagery. I'm not entirely sure what Peter's trying to say.
Hi, I'm in the English Channel. It is cold, exceedingly wet. I am the voice of Britain before Daily Express. My name is Britannia. This is my song. It is called Dancing with the Moonlit Night. That was Peter Gabriel's intro before he would sing this.
Well, that's lovely. So there we go. So that's the theatrical bent that Peter brought to this proceeding. Personally, I effing love it. Like I was going to say, I think super brave and super powerful to start with just this like a cappella, whatever. And then it builds, like you get the piano coming in. And then the song kind of kicks off.
Yeah. And the little guitar tingly-ting riff a little bit, like a minute in, just kind of adds to it as well. It's a very nice beginning to the album.
Yeah.
Speaking of the costumes, earlier we were talking about how there's no song that kind of goes too long or you're racing to the finish or offensive. If someone walked in on me and I was listening to Cat Food by King Crimson, I would be like, whoa, let's turn the volume down. Like, you'd be a little embarrassed. And, not that you could watch Genesis live on TV, but if you could, and someone walked in the room, I would be like, immediately grab the remote, like, whoa, I wasn't watching anything. Because it's like, I'm sorry, but like, it's just, yeah, this is that prog rock indulgence people make fun of us for.
Maybe because Dungeons and Dragons has become more popular or come back due to Stranger Things, right? They play D&D, and it's kind of brought it back to the forefront of pop culture today. I immediately associated it with like the Tolkienism. And so it didn't feel self-indulgent. It felt like nerds who became musicians. I had flashbacks to being in high school choir and singing madrigals because those were the cheapest. That was the cheapest sheet music you could get. Right? Was the really old music from the Renaissance? So you sing the poor public.
So the
school.
copyrights expired.
Exactly. So you sing a lot of madrigals if you go to a poor public high school. And that was immediately what I thought of upon listening to this opening, which isn't to say I didn't enjoy it. I'll say that madrigal chord progressions tend to be very similar across the whole genre and very predictable, whereas the melody and some of the chord progressions in Dancing with the Moonlit Night were unexpected, but still pleasing to the ear. But I did have flashbacks to a D&D table with, someone who's playing a bard just breaking out into song. It was me.
Wait,
I'm the bard. I break out into song.
Oh, boy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, only Peter Gabriel dressed up. Like, it's not like, well, before we started recording, Ian, you mentioned seeing Lordi, and I think like they are all in costumes, but it's just Peter Gabriel, right?
Yeah, so funnily enough, Steve Hackett said we always just felt like his pit orchestra because basically there's like a light on Peter Gabriel and then the other four guys are just in the background playing his songs. I actually think that's kind of nice. I really like the idea of someone putting on a show. Like, I actually would, I'd have loved to have seen this era of Genesis only for the fact it's like, oh, yeah, you're not just going to see some people play, like, keyboards and stuff. It's, you have no idea what the hell Peter Gabriel's going to get up to. We're not going to talk about the next album, which is Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, but that was one of the things that the band feels kind of crumbled the whole thing, is that Peter's costume work got so outrageous that it stopped him from singing at all.
Yeah, you start to get into the difference between artist and musician, which everyone has different opinions on as to what defines each of those callings. But in general, the artists tend to be the ones who don the costumes.
Yep, and he's donning that costume. I mean, needless to say, when Phil took over, I think it was the first thing that got scrapped. So speaking of musician, what do you think about his voice?
Again, going back to what I said at the beginning, which is that I'm more familiar with Peter Gabriel in the 80s. It's fun to hear his younger voice because it is different. You can hear that he's less mature, and it lends itself well to this madrigal, whimsical type music quite well. Because the whole goal of or I shouldn't say the goal.
The theme.
It sounds very British. That's a stupid thing to say. It's very obvious, but it sounds very Old English, like his tone, his diction, and it works really well with the theme of the album.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think even the way he literally says the words, he says well instead of farewell. Obviously, in this song specifically, he's dropping Thames and he's dropping Englishisms.
The tone is just so boyish and young and almost childlike, right? And it works, I think.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, and I think he crams a lot of weird-ass lyrics into bars. And I actually think this is a huge credit to Peter Gabriel that he's able to do this. Like, I'm always amazed at the syllables he manages to fit per unit of music.
It's a skill for sure. And still have the lyrics be, recognizable as actual words. Yeah.
And it sounds like natural.
I think it largely fits the lyrics because I think it gets quite triumphant, doesn't it? Yep. About halfway through.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a marching band vibe that I get from it. Just sort of, here we are, here we go.
Strap in.
Yeah. I think that kind of helps with the fact that it's 8 minutes long. You need a bit need a bit of forward momentum with a thicker song.
Yeah, keep pulling you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I was going to say, I guess the related question is, does the music help or hurt Peter's stories? I can't think of them specifically, like specific examples, but I feel like in general, Peter's stories and the music are the same thing.
They're basically one and the same in my mind as well.
Yeah. And actually, I think the thing I really noticed upon this listen, I love most of the lyrics. Like, frankly, this is an album where the lyrics have always just been in the background, like hard in the background for me, because the song all of the songs just float along. I love Peter Gabriel's lyrics.
They're rather fanciful.
Rather fanciful indeed. I was going to say, it's funny because it was just like this, album is like, oh, he's commenting on Britain or something. And it's like, I guess that's probably true. And if you really thought about it.
Yeah.
But it sounds like just pretty cool, almost like William Blake poetry. Kind of just like groovy Victorian political commentary.
This is a wider issue, I think, with Prog and me, is that...
Okay. This is your memoir.
Usually they say so much nonsense that I kind of check out with the actual meaning of their words.
I was about to take it personally, but I think that's fair.
it's like I really enjoy it, but then I've never been able to dig in deep.
You're just confused and unmoored.
Yeah, I'm here for the ride,
Yeah, that's fine.
But I think it's just him trying to be kind of, I fucking hate the word whimsical, but I can't think of any other word, sort of.
I mean, you're on this podcast. There's nothing you can do about that anymore.
You know what? People should take a shot every time they hear the word smooth and whimsical.
I was actually, now that I think about it, I don't know what else you're supposed to say about Prog. We're shutting it down, everyone. Turn off the lights.
It's just the first episode. Hey guys, okay, so Prog is smooth and whimsical.
Smooth and whimsical.
See you later.
Fabulous.
Yes, it is very Yodie, and I can definitely see the connection to Nursery Crime via that.
Yeah, or Music Box.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does anyone have any other thoughts about the soundscapes of this song?
I love the middle riff. It's so
nice.
Out there that you wouldn't expect it from the first minute, but for whatever reason it feels like it fits. Yeah,
that they just decide to break it down.
Yeah. The Mellotron is interesting. I'm not surprised that they, use this voice variant or setting.
I think it's cool because obviously they can sing backup harmonies with Peter, but the Mellotron adds like this truly ethereal sound.
Yeah.
Like it's not right.
Yeah. I mean, we do this sort of stuff today in modern producing, don't we, really? We put in pads or whatever that mimic the vocal line or even like mess around with the formant of the voice of a singer and it doesn't sound real. Doesn't sound like a human singing, but
that's kind of the point.
Yeah, that's the point. It brings
strangeness.
Yeah, usually what's lost in the vocal of the singer. So yeah,
there you go. So now it's time for us to get a gerb, and we are going to go to I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe. So this song is formed of a jam between Phil and Steve. It's got this lovely rolling melody, kind of a rolling beat. It's a crisp 4 minutes, and thus it was their first hit single in a loose sense of the term. It got to 21 on the UK charts. But yeah, I think for me, it does everything a single needs to do. Like when you get down to it, it presents all of Genesis in a very listenable 4 minutes. And I think you hit all of the kind of fun instrumentation and then Peter Gabriel singing a really weird story. And I think they all accomplish it in 4 minutes. And I think that's the essence of a great single.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I definitely agree. I do wonder if Firth the Fifth or Moonlit Night, if they were half the length, would they also be hits? Is it just the length that's sort of
that's interesting.
The cause for their, well, the reason they're not popular, they aren't so widely successful?
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say.
I would say, they're just obviously more 8-minute prog songs. There's kind of nothing else you can call them.
I love this song. It's one of the best attempts at a single by a prog rock band, I feel. The mass appeal, and I'm not counting like 90125, but like pure prog rock.
This prog, yeah.
Yeah. It's jammy, it was fun. Unlike you, Ian, I do have some mixed feelings on the lyrics of some of these songs, but I really enjoyed the lyrics to this song.
I mean, I effing love these lyrics. I think it's the thing I always wish I was able to do is just be okay enough, like just like with just enough. And I feel like that's what the song's trying to get across. And you just like, oh yeah, actually I would like to be a lawnmower. That does sound nice. So the song I find to be quite relaxing on a content level as well as a musical level.
I got Beatles vibes from this song, and it was probably the sitar in the background lending itself to that psychedelic rock feel that seems to ooze out of every measure in this song.
No, you are 100% right. They had explicitly done this to be kind of a Beatlesy song, and I think it's like a sitar guitar that they use in Close to the Edge as well, and I love that sound. Like, I just love that sound. And again, I think it kind of it helps the song kind of roll along. And the same with the doing doing drums. Like, I don't know what the doing doing drums are, but I just love those. And then I love the inclusion. I think it's Tony Banks on a keyboard, but he makes the sound of a lawnmower.
Yes, on the Mellotron. Keyboardist Tony Banks used a note played on the low end of the Mellotron during the intro and ending to imitate the sound of a lawnmower.
Yeah. No, and it transports you. It transports you to that field.
Yeah, it really does. So in a review of the song in The Guardian, the Stevie Chick refers to this as a hippie reverie, which I really like. I think is a good way to describe this song.
No, I mean, it puts you in the field, like just feeling like you're kind of lazing about on the field. But also, I think, like the Dubliners, the James Joyce book, when you're like dropped into a short story. I guess this is the power of the short story. You dropped in for 4 pages and you feel like there's a whole world in there. And I feel like that's what this song does. In 2 verses, I feel like I want to know everything there is to know about Jacob and Ethel and whatever the hell's going on in his life. Like, I actually feel like I can't believe how well Peter captured this little tiny world.
Yeah.
So one other thought I had about the song, Genesis are actually normally a fairly tight band, but this song's messy. And I say that with love, but I wonder if they kind of purposely did it to enhance that kind of loose vibe in the song.
Yeah. I think they absolutely did. There's so, or I would call it Foley rich, right?
Okay, yeah.
There is so much Foley in the background.
Yeah.
And I think that inevitably adds to the rolling groove, but also kind of adds just extra rhythm that brings that chaotic feel. Yeah.
Brings the doing-doings out.
The doing-doings.
Okay.
They are very necessary.
So that will do us for now. I want to thank my guests. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And we shall see you next time for the second half of Selling England by the Pound. I've been your host, Ian Prize, and this has been a sort of young person's guide to prog rock.